In the far North Pacific, where the Coral Chain bends toward Alaska, a scattered arc of islands formed a little-known front in the Pacific War. The Komandorski Islands, lying off the Soviet coast, and the Aleutian Islands, stretching from Alaska toward Asia, framed a corridor of ocean that both Tokyo and Washington viewed as a vulnerable flank. For Japan, it bordered approaches to the home islands and to the northern sea routes. For the United States, it was part of the national coastline and a potential avenue toward the continental west coast, and the Alaska-Siberia air ferry route supplying the USSR. In the first half of 1942, Imperial Japanese forces advanced across the Pacific. Alongside operations against Midway in June, the Japanese Navy carried out Operation AL, landing on Kiska on the 6th of June and Attu on the 7th of June, 1942. These landings placed Japanese garrisons on American territory for the first time since the 19th century. On Kiska, an initial force of roughly 500 Special Naval Landing Forces troops was later expanded to more than 5,100 personnel. On Attu, an Army detachment that would grow to about 2,600 soldiers occupied the island and began constructing defensive positions and air facilities. Strategically, Tokyo intended these outposts to shield the northern approaches to the empire, complicate any American thrust toward the Kuriles, and provide bases for patrol aircraft and submarines along the North Pacific shipping lanes. At the same time, the Aleutian occupation supported a broader Japanese concept of a perimeter defense stretching from the Aleutians through the Central Pacific to the Solomons. For American planners, the presence of foreign troops on Attu and Kiska carried both military and political weight. It threatened weather stations, air routes, and sea lines, and it had symbolic significance as an occupation of U.S. soil, even though the local civilian population had been removed or captured. Command arrangements reflected these priorities. Japan assigned responsibility for the Northern Theater to the Fifth Fleet under Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya, operating from bases in Hokkaido and the Kuriles, coordinating Army garrisons on Attu and Navy units on Kiska with limited surface and submarine forces. The United States created a separate North Pacific command structure under Admiral Chester Nimitz's overall authority, with Admiral Thomas Kincaid directing naval operations and the U.S. 11th Air Force flying from bases such as Adak and Amchitka. Yet in both capitals, the Aleutians remained subordinate to other priorities. In Tokyo, resources were concentrated on the Solomons and New Guinea. The Northern Theater received older cruisers and destroyers with limited carrier and air support. In Washington, Guadalcanal, North Africa, and the Central Pacific consumed attention and shipping. The Aleutian campaign unfolded with fewer troops and ships than other theaters, in an environment where fog, storms, and low temperatures often claimed more equipment and men than direct combat. By late 1942 and early 1943, however, the balance in the Aleutians began to shift. American air and submarine attacks against Japanese supply lines to Kiska and Attu increased, sinking tankers, cargo vessels, and escorts in and around Kiska Harbor. One engagement on July 5, 1942, in which a U.S. submarine attacked a group of destroyers, caused over 200 Japanese casualties at sea. For the garrisons, this meant strained stocks of fuel, ammunition, and food, especially through the winter, and growing reliance on convoys sailing under cover of darkness and bad weather. Intelligence on both sides contained significant gaps. American estimates of Japanese strength on Attu in early 1943 were as low as 500 men, well below the approximately 2,500 to 2,600 actually present. In contrast, later estimates of Kiska's garrison would climb toward 10,000 when the real figure was about 5,200. Japanese commanders, for their part, had limited visibility into the exact size and readiness of U.S. naval and air forces assembling in the eastern Aleutians, and could only infer American intentions from patrol patterns and bombing raids. Public perception differed sharply from operational reality. In the United States, the occupation of Attu and Kiska appeared in news reports and official statements, but it never dominated headlines in the same way as fighting in the South Pacific or North Africa. Families in Alaska and on the Pacific coast paid close attention, while many Americans elsewhere registered the Aleutians as one theater among many. In Japan, the Aleutian outposts figured in propaganda as examples of forward defense and endurance in extreme conditions, but the garrisons experienced long periods of isolation, limited contact with home, and routine work-building fortifications, airstrips, and shelters. By March 1943, these preconditions converged into a specific operational problem. The Japanese garrisons on Attu and Kiska, totaling roughly 3,500 and 5,200 personnel, depended on a thin surface supply line that was increasingly vulnerable to American interception. American commanders, tasked with preventing reinforcement and resupply, sought opportunities to disrupt these convoys without diverting major forces from other fronts. Within this narrow, storm-lashed stretch of ocean, the decision to send a reinforced Japanese convoy toward the Aleutians and a small U.S. cruiser-destroyer group to patrol west of Attu set the stage for the surface engagement that would follow near the Komandorski Islands on the 27th of March, 1943. In March 1943, the Japanese Fifth Fleet received orders to push a major supply convoy through to Attu. The garrison there, built up since autumn 1942, required ammunition, construction materials, aviation fuel, and replacements. The convoy was organized around two large auxiliary transports carrying several thousand tons of cargo, with additional personnel and equipment embarked. To protect them, the Navy assembled a surface escort stronger than previous runs. The heavy cruisers Nachi and Maya, the light cruiser Tama, the light cruiser Abukuma as flagship, and several destroyers drawn from Northern Patrol and escort duties. Their task was to escort the transports into the waters west of Attu, unload under cover of night and weather, and return before American forces could concentrate. Vice Admiral Bashiro Hosogaya, responsible for the Northern Theater, faced a trade-off. Submarines alone could not move heavy materials in the quantities needed, and aircraft operating from the Kuriles had limited reach in poor weather. Surface convoys remained essential, yet American submarines and aircraft had demonstrated that unescorted or lightly protected runs were vulnerable. Reinforcing the escort with cruisers increased protection, but also risked those ships in the event of interception. The decision to employ Nachi and Maya reflected an assessment that the convoy could reach Attu under cover of the long subarctic night and the prevailing fog, and that any American surface units in the area would likely be outnumbered. On the American side, the North Pacific Command aimed to prevent precisely such reinforcement. Intelligence from radio traffic analysis and air reconnaissance indicated that Japanese shipping to the western Aleutians followed certain patterns and entered the region along expected tracks. Rear Admiral Charles McMorris was given command of a small surface group designated to patrol near the Komandorski Islands, an isolated cluster roughly between Attu and the Soviet Kamchatka Peninsula. This position allowed interception attempts without moving too close to Japanese land-based air in the Kuriles. McMorris's force consisted of the heavy cruiser Salt Lake City, the light cruiser Richmond, and 4 destroyers, Bailey, Coghlan, Dale, and Monaghan. The group combined one modern heavy cruiser armed with 8-inch guns, an older light cruiser with 6-inch guns, and destroyers equipped with torpedoes and 5-inch guns. Fuel constraints, the distances involved, and other requirements in the Pacific limited the number and type of ships that could be assigned. The formation's mission was to disrupt enemy supply lines rather than to seek decisive battle with a superior fleet. The conditions under which both groups operated shaped their opening moves. The Aleutian Theater in late March was marked by low temperatures, frequent snow and sleet, and rapidly shifting visibility. Seas could be rough, with swells that complicated gunnery and made lookout duty demanding. For Japanese sailors on the convoy, this meant long hours at action stations in cold wind, with watches extended during expected contact periods. American crews, similarly, spent nights at high alert, aware that radar and optical sightings could be obscured without warning. As the reinforced Japanese convoy advanced eastward from the Kuriles toward the Aleutians, its commanders balanced speed against fuel expenditure and formation integrity. The transports needed steady progress. The cruisers and destroyers maneuvered to screen possible submarine approach routes and to be ready to respond to surface threats. Radio discipline remained tight to reduce the chances of detection by American signals intelligence. At the same time, weather reports from the area were incomplete, so the exact visibility they would face near the Komandorski Islands remained uncertain. American planning for the patrol stressed early detection and delaying action. McMorris did not have carrier air support. Land-based aircraft from the eastern Aleutians could not remain continuously overhead in the distant patrol area. Radar on Salt Lake City and Richmond offered an advantage in certain conditions, but range and reliability depended on sea state and atmospheric factors. The destroyers extended the group's scouting capability, yet they also had limited endurance. The plan therefore relied on a combination of radar sweeps, lookouts, and pre-selected patrol lines that intersected likely convoy tracks. In both navies, the opening phase of this sortie reflected broader doctrinal expectations. Japanese surface doctrine still anticipated gunnery engagements at medium to long ranges, supported by torpedo attacks, and emphasized coordinated maneuvers by cruisers and destroyers. American doctrine in the North Pacific, shaped by experiences elsewhere but constrained by the local environment, focused on using radar to gain initial contact and then employing destroyers aggressively while heavy ships engaged at range. The commanders on both sides understood these principles, yet the specific engagement would test how they worked amid fog banks and changing light near the dateline. On the night before contact, officers and crew on both formations prepared for a possible encounter without knowing with certainty whether it would occur. For Japanese personnel on the transports, the priority was reaching Attu and unloading. Many had limited experience of surface combat and viewed the escorting cruisers and destroyers as their shield. For American sailors on the patrol group, the possibility of meeting a convoy with stronger escort meant readiness for a battle in which they might be outgunned, but still required to press the attack to fulfill their mission. These parallel expectations set the psychological and operational background for the first radar and visual contacts that would mark the formal beginning of the Battle of the Komandorski Islands. Strategic objectives in the Northern Theater were defined in broader war plans, but translated into specific measurable tasks for the forces near the Komandorski Islands. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters expected the Aleutian outposts to hold as a forward screen on the Empire's northern flank. The immediate aim of the March 1943 convoy was to deliver enough fuel, ammunition, and engineering stores to Attu for the garrison to maintain operations through the next season and to continue building airfields and defensive systems. Longer term, planners viewed Attu and Kiska as bases from which patrol aircraft and submarines could monitor American movements and, if conditions allowed, harass shipping in the North Pacific. For the Fifth Fleet, success meant keeping the line of communication open despite increasing American pressure. American leaders, by contrast, had adopted a strategy of attrition and isolation for the Aleutian garrisons prior to large-scale amphibious operations. The Navy's North Pacific force sought to reduce the flow of supplies to Attu and Kiska, weaken the garrisons before any landings, and protect the sea lanes between the continental United States, Alaska, and the Soviet Far East. Rear Admiral McMorris's surface group was a component of this wider plan, a relatively small mobile force positioned to intercept convoys at range, with air and submarine units providing additional pressure. In planning documents, the primary objective was not to destroy enemy cruisers at any cost, but to disrupt logistics and force the Japanese command to reconsider the feasibility of maintaining distant island positions. Logistical considerations shaped these plans in concrete ways. Japanese transports carried finite quantities of fuel oil and ammunition for both the garrisons and the escorting warships. The Fifth Fleet's cruisers and destroyers operating from northern bases had to ration underway time and gunnery practice, preserving barrels and shells for combat. Convoys were scheduled to exploit seasonal patterns of darkness and poor visibility, hoping to move through the most exposed stretches of ocean when American air reconnaissance was least effective. At the same time, limited tanker capacity and competing demands from other theaters restricted how often large, heavily escorted convoys could be mounted. The American side faced comparable constraints. The heavy cruiser Salt Lake City and the light cruiser Richmond operated far from major repair facilities, with supply chains stretching back to bases in the eastern Aleutians and beyond. Fuel state-influenced patrol patterns. Prolonged high-speed steaming in cold, rough seas would shorten time on station. Ammunition stocks, including 8-inch shells and torpedoes, had to be managed carefully since resupply in theater was not guaranteed immediately after an engagement. Operational orders for McMorris reflected this balance. Patrol aggressively enough to threaten Japanese shipping, but avoid unnecessary expenditure of fuel and munitions in pursuits unlikely to succeed. Doctrine and weapons planning added another layer. Japanese surface forces still placed heavy emphasis on night fighting and on the use of 610mm oxygen torpedoes, which had long range and a powerful warhead training, before the sortie included review of night engagement procedures and coordinated torpedo attacks by destroyers under cruiser direction. American planners, aware in general terms of Japanese torpedo capabilities, but not always of their full range, focused their group strength on radar-directed gunnery and the use of destroyers for screening and, when conditions allowed, torpedo attacks of their own. Standard operating procedures required that radar contacts be developed methodically, and that formations maintain cohesion to avoid confusion and poor visibility. Intelligence assessments underlying these plans contained uncertainties. Japanese staff officers estimated that American naval forces in the area were limited to a few cruisers and destroyers, with air support constrained by distance and weather. They did not expect carrier groups in the immediate vicinity. American intelligence analysts, drawing on intercepted communications and reconnaissance, assessed that Japanese convoys to the western Aleutians might be accompanied by 1 or 2 major surface combatants and several destroyers, but exact compositions remained guesswork. Both sides anticipated the possibility of contact, yet underestimated elements of the opponent's strength, structure, or tactics. Preparatory measures extended to crew training and ship readiness. On the Japanese convoy, gunnery crews checked fire control instruments, and damage control parties reviewed assignments for flooding and fire scenarios. Transports rehearsed blackout procedures and rapid unloading drills to shorten time exposed off Attu. On the American patrol group, radar operators conducted repeated calibration runs, and lookouts were briefed on likely bearing lines for approaching ships based on expected convoy routes. Engineering departments on both sides prepared for sustained high-speed maneuvering in cold water that could strain machinery. Political and psychological dimensions also influenced planning, even if they did not appear directly in operational orders. For Japan, maintaining a visible foothold on former American territory supported the image of a broad defensive perimeter. Losing or allowing the isolation of these garrisons could be interpreted as a contraction of that perimeter. For the United States, intercepting and turning back a major convoy would demonstrate that the Navy could contest remote sea lanes and gradually reassert control over the Aleutian chain without immediately diverting large carrier forces from other fronts. These expectations framed how success and failure in any engagement would later be interpreted by governments and the public. Within these constraints and aims, the March 1943 sortie toward the Komandorski Islands represented a calculated risk for both commands. Japanese planners accepted the possibility of running into American surface forces in exchange for the prospect of significantly strengthening Attu. American planners accepted the risk that a lightly outnumbered group might encounter a stronger escort, relying on radar, training, and surprise to compensate. The engagement that would follow would reveal how these strategic goals and planning assumptions interacted once ships on both sides entered visual and radar range in the open waters north of the Aleutian chain. Shortly after dawn, on 27 March 1943, the American patrol group steaming near the Komandorski Islands detected contacts on radar. Operators aboard Salt Lake City reported multiple returns at long range off the western horizon, consistent with a column of large ships with escorts. The information was relayed to Rear Admiral McMorris and to the other ships in the formation. Because radar echoes did not immediately distinguish between cruisers, destroyers, and transports, there was initial uncertainty about the exact composition and course of the approaching force. As the range gradually closed, McMorris turned his group to investigate while maintaining a formation that allowed both cruisers to bring their main batteries to bear and the destroyers to screen against torpedo attack. Lookouts strained to pick out silhouettes through haze and intermittent patches of clearer visibility. On the Japanese side, visual and optical detection preceded or complemented any radar reports. Officers on the escorts and cruisers observed masts and superstructures of unknown ships ahead, and reports moved quickly up the chain to Vice Admiral Hosogaya on his flagship. A key early decision concerned the safety of the Japanese transports. Once it was clear that the contacts represented an organized American surface group rather than isolated patrol vessels, Hosogaya ordered the transports to turn away and withdraw toward the rear, while the cruisers and destroyers maneuvered to place themselves between the convoy and the approaching enemy. This movement converted the Japanese formation from a convoy disposition into a battle group, with Nachi and Maya aligned for gunnery action, and the lighter ships adjusting positions for screening and torpedo opportunities. On the American side, McMorris initially believed he might be facing a force comparable in strength to his own, and considered closing to engage in order to disrupt the convoy. As additional masts and funnels appeared through the mist, it became apparent that the opposing force comprised at least 2 heavy cruisers and multiple lighter vessels. This recognition altered the tactical problem. The American group would likely be outgunned in a direct exchange, yet its mission of interception remained. McMorris chose to turn his formation to a course that both preserved the possibility of engagement and increased distance from the transports, aiming to draw the Japanese warships away from their charges. The first exchanges of fire began at long range, with Japanese heavy cruisers opening with salvos aimed primarily at Salt Lake City as the most formidable American unit. Shell splashes rose around the cruiser as Japanese gunners adjusted their fire based on spotting reports. Salt Lake City and Richmond replied with their main batteries, using radar ranges where possible and optical spotting when visibility allowed. The destroyers joined in with 5-inch guns when range and arcs of fire permitted, while still maintaining their screening positions. Initial gunnery on both sides involved corrections for relative motion, wind, and sea state. The subarctic swell and intermittent visibility complicated range finding and spotting. Japanese fire control teams had to account for the Americans' maneuvers and the changing bearing as both formations altered course. American gunnery officers, for their part, faced the task of engaging heavier ships at distances where any hit received could damage critical systems, while their own shells needed accurate solutions to be effective against armored targets. During these first engagements, torpedoes were already part of the tactical calculus, even before any were launched. Japanese destroyer and cruiser commanders looked for opportunities to close within effective torpedo range without exposing their ships unnecessarily to concentrated gunfire. American commanders, aware of the risk of long-range torpedoes, adjusted course and speed to complicate torpedo solutions, using the destroyer screen to interpose between potential launch points and the cruisers. The early phase of the battle also featured repeated course changes as both sides sought advantageous positions. Hosogaya maneuvered to keep his cruisers between the Americans and the withdrawing transports while trying to cross the enemy's line to bring maximum guns to bear. McMorris aimed to avoid being cut off from his route of withdrawal to the east and south, while continuing to pose a threat that would compel the Japanese cruisers to focus on his group rather than attempting to reform around the convoy. For the crews aboard both formations, the beginning of the engagement shifted routine watchstanding into active combat conditions. Damage control parties moved to readiness stations. Medical personnel prepared for casualties. Ammunition supply parties on the cruisers and destroyers began sustained work feeding shells and powder to the guns. On the Japanese transports, crews watched the distant exchange of flashes and splashes, aware that their own fate depended on the outcome, but unable to influence it directly. In this initial clash phase, the battle's pattern of long-range gunnery, maneuver, and the constant possibility of torpedo use was established. setting the conditions for the later intensification of fire and damage on both sides. As the battle progressed through the morning, the exchange of fire intensified. Japanese heavy cruisers concentrated on the American formation at long range, while Richmond and Salt Lake City worked to maintain steady salvos despite sea state and maneuvering. Early in this phase, shells from Richmond found Nachi. Hits on the signal bridge and mainmast caused casualties among staff and communications personnel and disrupted flagship radio links. Additional impacts near the torpedo battery and control spaces injured more crew and temporarily reduced electrical power for gun and ammunition handling, forcing Nachi to ease back in the line. With Nachi's fire control momentarily constrained, Maya increasingly shouldered the task of engaging Salt Lake City. Around mid-morning, repeated 8-inch shell hits struck the American heavy cruiser. One projectile ignited the starboard float plane, which was jettisoned overboard. Other hits opened plates near engineering spaces and fuel tanks, allowing seawater and oil to mix and causing localized flooding. Damage control teams moved to counter lists and maintain propulsion as the ship continued to fire from available turrets. Accounts from the engine rooms later described how incoming water contaminated fuel in use, complicating boiler operation even before the most serious interruption of power. Both sides responded to the increasingly damaging gunnery with adjustments in tactics. Earlier in the action, Nachi had already launched a spread of long-range torpedoes that failed to find targets, underscoring the difficulty of obtaining accurate solutions against maneuvering opponents at distance. Japanese cruisers adopted zigzag patterns to bring all turrets to bear and to disrupt American rangefinding. But these maneuvers also reduced the relative speed advantage that might have allowed them to close more rapidly. American ships altered course and speed periodically to complicate further torpedo attacks, while trying to keep their main batteries bearing on the principal Japanese units. As ammunition expenditure mounted, material strains became more visible. Salt Lake City's magazines saw heavy use of armor-piercing shells. Later in the engagement, the crew began to supplement these with high-capacity rounds. Once stores of armor-piercing ammunition neared depletion, powder and shells were moved by hand from forward magazines to aft turrets to keep stern guns active while the ship maneuvered away from the Japanese line. At some point during this phase, structural damage to the steering system reduced the range of rudder movement, limiting the cruiser's ability to make rapid course changes and making it more difficult to evade concentrated fire. The crisis deepened near midday. After sustaining several additional hits, Salt Lake City experienced a critical systems failure when seawater entered a fuel tank that was feeding the boilers. Contamination extinguished the fires, and the cruiser gradually lost way until she came nearly dead in the water. For several minutes, the principal American surface combatant in the area lay with little speed, emitting smoke from fires and damage while enemy cruisers continued to close. The American commander ordered destroyers to prepare for a torpedo attack and directed Richmond and Dale to lay smoke between the disabled heavy cruiser and the advancing Japanese line to reduce the accuracy of incoming fire. The destroyers Bailey, Coghlan, and Monahan increased speed to advance toward the Japanese cruisers. Bailey pressed closest, closing to a range of under 10,000 yards before launching a spread of 5 torpedoes. None struck, but the attack forced Japanese gunners to focus attention on the approaching destroyer, as well as the damaged heavy cruiser. In the process, Bailey received multiple 8-inch hits that disabled machinery, started fires, and caused casualties among her crew. Contemporary reports record 5 killed and several wounded, and the ship came temporarily to a stop before damage control contained flooding and restored limited propulsion. Coghlan was also hit once, adding to the accumulation of damage in the American screen. On the Japanese side, Nachi's earlier damage had already resulted in significant losses. More than a dozen personnel killed and over 24 wounded in the bridge and control areas from Richmond's hits, along with further casualties in control compartments. The need to manage fires, damage communications equipment, and impaired electrical systems placed sustained demands on the flagship's damage control and engineering teams, even as the ship remained engaged. Maya, while less heavily damaged at this point, had to maintain high rates of fire and maneuver under the same subarctic conditions. Altogether, the Japanese squadron was now fighting with one principal cruiser partially degraded, and others under increasing logistical and mechanical strain. Throughout this escalation, neither side could rely on immediate reinforcement. The remoteness of the area and weather conditions limited effective air support. A group of American bombers dispatched from Adak failed to locate the battle in fog and low cloud, while no Japanese carrier or land-based aircraft intervened directly in the engagement area. The confrontation thus remained a prolonged surface duel in which the outcome would depend on the endurance, damage control, and tactical decisions of the ships already committed, rather than on external intervention. By the end of this phase, both formations had experienced material damage, casualties, and ammunition expenditure at levels that weighed heavily on commanders' calculations. The American group faced the immediate possibility that its only heavy cruiser might be rendered permanently inoperative in the presence of superior enemy guns. Japanese leaders had to consider the growing damage to at least one of their own cruisers, the fuel and ammunition state of the squadron, and the risk that extended engagement close to the Aleutians could expose them to later air attack. These combined pressures define the crisis point of the battle and set the conditions under which subsequent decisions about continuing or breaking off action would be made. Around midday, the engagement reached its most intense phase. Salt Lake City, already carrying hull damage, steering restrictions, and fuel contamination from earlier hits, lay nearly stopped while engineers struggled to relight boilers and clear water from feed lines. On her decks, crewmen worked to jettison weight, remove wreckage, and keep remaining turrets supplied. Casualty parties moved stretcher cases from exposed positions to battle dressing stations below, where medical teams treated shrapnel and burn injuries under artificial light as the ship rolled slowly in the swell. The American formation's geometry reflected this crisis. Richmond maneuvered to one side of Salt Lake City, laying smoke with Dale to obscure Japanese fire control optics. The destroyers that had launched torpedoes turned away at high speed once their spreads were in the water, zigzagging to reduce the chance of further heavy shell hits. Bailey, which had advanced closest, bore scars of the attack: a damaged engine room, wrecked gun positions, and at least 5 dead and several wounded among a crew of roughly 250. Yet her damage control parties succeeded in halting progressive flooding and restoring enough power for the ship to rejoin the screen at reduced speed. On the Japanese side, Nachi and Maya continued to close the range, still firing at Salt Lake City whenever smoke and visibility allowed. Nachi's earlier damage, including casualties estimated in the tens on the bridge and among control personnel, forced internal reorganization. Backup communications lines were run, and secondary fire control positions assumed part of the workload. Maya, which had not suffered comparable structural hits by this stage, remained the most effective Japanese gun platform. Shell expenditure on both heavy cruisers rose sharply, with magazine crews maintaining a continuous chain of ammunition supply under conditions of vibration and cold. The interplay of gunnery and maneuver during this peak period highlighted different tactical priorities. Japanese cruisers sought positions that allowed them to concentrate fire on Salt Lake City, while still guarding against renewed destroyer torpedo attacks. This meant balancing pursuit on roughly parallel courses with periodic changes in bearing to avoid presenting an optimal target. The American group, constrained by Salt Lake City's limited speed, focused on maintaining a screen and smoke cover that would prevent precise spotting, accepting that their own gunnery accuracy would also suffer. Within Salt Lake City's engineering spaces, the recovery effort shaped the course of the battle as much as any decision on the bridge. Engineering officers ordered fuel transfers, adjustments to feed lines, and rapid boiler relighting procedures while monitoring for the risk of explosion or further flooding. Gradually, steam pressure built up again, and the cruiser began to regain headway, first a few knots, then more. This partial restoration of mobility allowed McMorris to consider options beyond standing and absorbing fire or preparing for scuttling. Material limitations influenced high command decisions during this phase. The American group had expended a significant fraction of its armor-piercing ammunition. Forward turrets had fewer suitable shells than aft mounts, and some magazines had to be backfed to keep all remaining guns operational. Torpedo stocks on the destroyers were reduced after the attack runs. On the Japanese side, estimates compiled after the battle indicate that Nachi and Maya had fired several hundred 8-inch shells each, consuming a large share of the allotment carried for a single sortie and increasing the strain on barrel linings and loading systems. At this point, the broader operational context began to weigh more heavily on Japanese calculations. Hosogaya had to evaluate whether continued pursuit and gunnery would lead to the destruction of the American heavy cruiser and possibly other ships, or whether the risks of extended engagement near the limit of his supporting infrastructure now outweighed probable gains. Factors included Nachi's existing damage, the possibility of new American air attacks from the east if the squadron remained in the area into the afternoon, and the fuel state required for a safe return to northern bases. The escort's original mission, to ensure that the transports reached Attu safely with their cargo, had already been compromised by the earlier diversion of the convoy. On the American side, McMorris interpreted the survival of his flagship and the completed torpedo attacks as partial fulfillment of his mission to disrupt the convoy, even though no transport had been sunk. His immediate concern remained the safe withdrawal of a group that now included one damaged heavy cruiser, one lightly armed older cruiser, and destroyers with varying degrees of damage and ammunition depletion. During this peak period of the battle, tactical signals reflected an emphasis on maintaining formation, preserving the ability to lay smoke, and preparing for further torpedo threats rather than seeking a renewed close-range gunnery engagement. For the crews involved, these hours represented the climax of sustained strain. Gun crews had been at station since early morning. Many had fired hundreds of rounds, handling heavy shells and powder charges in cold air and spray lookouts, exposed to wind and freezing temperatures, continued scanning for torpedo wakes and muzzle flashes. Damage control and medical personnel moved repeatedly through smoke-filled compartments. Japanese sailors on the cruisers and destroyers, facing incoming salvos and the possibility of torpedo hits, worked under comparable conditions, aware that their own shipboard stocks of fuel and ammunition were finite. By early afternoon, the immediate risk that Salt Lake City would be lost in place had diminished due to restored propulsion and the cumulative effects of smoke screens and range changes. At the same time, the Japanese squadron's ability to continue aggressive pursuit was constrained by damage, ammunition expenditure, and the distance from secure waters. These converging factors marked the high point of the battle's intensity and prepared the way for the decisions that would soon transform the engagement from an active pursuit into a mutual disengagement. In the hours after the heaviest exchanges, both groups adjusted their behavior in ways that reflected learning under pressure. On the American side, engineers and damage control teams aboard Salt Lake City modified standard procedures to cope with the contamination of fuel and the vulnerability of feed lines. Temporary bypasses were established, and fuel transfers were reordered to rely on less exposed tanks. Firefighting teams revised boundary cooling patterns to account for the cold seawater temperature and the risk of ice formation on exterior surfaces. These actions reduced the chance that further minor hits or spray would generate new machinery failures. In the destroyer screen, the experience of high-speed torpedo runs under heavy fire-shaped immediate tactical adaptations. Bailey's crew, having advanced to close range and suffered multiple shell impacts, updated their internal understanding of how quickly concentrated fire could disable a destroyer in this environment. Subsequent maneuvering by Bailey, Coughlin, and Monahan emphasized the use of smoke, rapid course changes, and staggered attack patterns rather than simultaneous approaches along similar tracks. Gunnery officers refined fire distribution, shifting from primarily targeting heavy cruisers to alternating salvos at destroyers and lighter ships when those appeared to be preparing torpedo attacks of their own. Richmond, as the lighter cruiser in the group, adapted to a dual role. In addition to contributing 6-inch gunfire, she increasingly served as a coordination platform and communications relay, helping to manage the formation, while Salt Lake City focused on remaining combat effective. Despite damage, radio operators and signalmen adjusted message formats to convey essential maneuvering and damage information more concisely, recognizing that the combination of smoke, distance, and intermittent static made long transmissions difficult to interpret. This contributed to maintaining cohesion during the gradual shift from close engagement toward disengagement courses. On the Japanese side, Nachi's bridge and control spaces reorganized around surviving systems and personnel. With primary communications partially degraded, secondary plotting rooms took on additional responsibilities for gunnery calculations and for maintaining the recognized plot of American positions. Damage control practices were adapted to conditions that included low temperatures, damaged electrical distribution, and the need to keep key fire control instruments functioning, despite shock from near-misses crew rotations, were adjusted to balance continued combat tasks with the need to relieve personnel who had been exposed on open decks since early morning. Japanese destroyers and light cruisers also integrated lessons from the American torpedo attacks. Although no torpedo hits had been achieved, the approach of Bailey and her consorts demonstrated how a determined destroyer attack could complicate heavy cruiser fire plans and force shifts in target priority. Commanders of Abukuma and the destroyers refined their screening pattern, increasing lateral spacing and altering courses to reduce the predictability of their positions relative to the heavy cruisers. Gunnery assignments were modified to ensure that at least some medium-caliber guns remained directed toward the American destroyers even when main batteries focused on Salt Lake City. Resource management became a central concern for both sides as the battle continued. American officers tracked remaining stocks of armor-piercing and high-capacity shells, 5-inch ammunition, and torpedoes, adjusting fire rates to preserve enough ordnance for potential defensive actions during withdrawal. Japanese staff aboard the flagship compiled rapid estimates of fuel consumption, remaining 8-inch and 5.5 or 5-inch shells, and torpedoes, comparing these against the distances required to return to their bases and the possibility of future encounters en route. This accounting influenced how aggressively further salvos and maneuvers could be sustained. Psychological adaptation was visible in the conduct of crews. On American ships, the realization that Salt Lake City had survived a period nearly dead in the water and regained speed reinforced a sense of resilience, even as awareness of continued vulnerability remained. Reports by later observers describe how gun crews maintained disciplined rates of fire despite fatigue, and how damage control teams treated repeated alarms as procedural tasks rather than as cause for disorganization. Among Japanese sailors, the knowledge that Nachi had taken hits and suffered casualties but remained operational contributed to a perception that the squadron could absorb damage while still fulfilling its protective role, although concerns about further losses grew as ammunition expenditure increased. Command decision-making on both sides began to incorporate these real-time adaptations. McMorris used updated information on Salt Lake City's machinery status and ammunition levels, as well as the condition of Bailey and Coghlan, to refine his orders toward a more deliberate withdrawal while retaining a posture that would deter a close pursuit. Hosogaya, receiving reports on Nachi's damage, overall ammunition consumption, and the distance already covered away from the original convoy track, reassessed the feasibility of continuing to press the engagement at the same intensity. In the absence of significant air reconnaissance during the battle itself, both commands also adapted their expectations about outside support. American commanders could not count on bombers finding and striking the Japanese squadron before nightfall. Japanese officers had to assume that remaining in the area increased the chance of later air attack as weather changed, even if no aircraft had yet appeared. This reinforced an emphasis on service capabilities and on the careful husbanding of resources already at sea. Altogether, the period following the most intense gunnery saw both formations shift from initial doctrinal templates toward more flexible practices shaped by the specific conditions north of the Aleutian chain. Changes in damage control, formation handling, fire discipline, and communications reflected an effort to stabilize each group's situation in preparation for whatever operational decision would follow regarding continuation or termination of the engagement. By early afternoon, range and bearing reports on both flagships showed that the geometry of the engagement had shifted. Salt Lake City had regained modest speed and was moving on a southeasterly course, screened by smoke and destroyers. The Japanese heavy cruisers, though still capable of bringing their main batteries to bear, now faced a longer chase to maintain effective fire. Shell splashes fell more erratically as range increased and visibility fluctuated, and salvo timing had to be adjusted to account for changing target aspects. On Nachi's flag bridge, staff officers presented Vice Admiral Hosogaya with updated summaries. Ammunition for the main batteries had been reduced significantly from initial levels. Fuel expenditure was higher than planned due to prolonged high-speed maneuvering, and damage to communications and control spaces remained only partly repaired. Reports from the other cruisers and destroyers indicated no catastrophic hits, but confirmed the cumulative strain on machinery and personnel. The transports which had turned away earlier were now distant and no longer on a direct course for Attu. In assessing his options, Hosogaya had to weigh multiple uncertainties. Continuing the pursuit might eventually bring the Japanese cruisers close enough again to achieve additional hits on Salt Lake City, or even other American ships, but it would extend the squadron's exposure in an area where weather could clear and allow American land-based aircraft to operate. Breaking off could preserve the force for future operations, but would leave the convoy's original mission incomplete, and accept that the American group had successfully interfered with the supply run. Intelligence about American reinforcements was limited. The possibility that other units might be moving into the region could not be ruled out. On the American side, McMorris read the gradual opening of distance and the reduction in incoming fire as indications that the Japanese squadron was reconsidering continued engagement. Signals between Salt Lake City, Richmond, and the destroyers stressed maintaining formation, preserving smoke capabilities, and preparing for renewed attacks if the enemy turned back in. At the same time, internal reports on ammunition and machinery highlighted the limits of the group's ability to sustain another period of concentrated exchange at close-range command calculations, balanced the objective of continuing to deter pursuit with the need to avoid maneuvers that would bring the force back within favorable range for Japanese guns and torpedoes. The absence of direct civilian presence on the battlefield did not mean that the turning of the engagement lacked human consequences beyond the ships involved. On Attu and Kiska, garrison personnel and any remaining local inhabitants would experience the effect in the form of delayed or reduced supplies. For families of sailors on both sides, the outcome of the battle would later be conveyed through casualty lists and official notices. In the broader region, including Alaska and northern Japan, the course of the engagement would influence perceptions of how secure or exposed these remote territories were to enemy action. Hosogaya's decision took form in a series of maneuvers rather than a single order visible to the opposing force. The Japanese cruisers began to alter course gradually away from the Americans, reducing pursuit and shifting toward a heading that pointed back toward home bases and the more secure waters near the Kuriles. Fire from the heavy guns became intermittent, then ceased altogether as range continued to increase. Destroyers adjusted positions to resume a screen, oriented toward potential threats from the east, rather than to support offensive closing movements. American lookouts and radar operators observed these changes in bearing and range. Messages within McMorris's group confirmed that the Japanese were turning away, and that the opportunity for further gunnery engagement on American terms was limited by their own fuel and ammunition state. Rather than attempting a counter-pursuit that could exhaust fuel reserves and expose damaged ships to renewed attack, McMorris maintained a course that continued to open the distance while preserving the option of further smoke-laying or torpedo attacks if the Japanese reversed course again. At the moment when both formations had clearly begun to separate, individual experiences aboard the ships reflected a shift in focus. Gun crews moved from continuous firing to maintenance tasks and ammunition accounting. Damage control teams consolidated their efforts, transitioning from emergency response to more methodical repairs and shoring. Medical personnel reviewed casualty lists and treatment priorities. On the Japanese ships, similar routines unfolded. Fire control teams secured equipment, and officers conducted initial debriefings on ammunition, expenditure, and system performance during the longest surface engagement many of them had yet experienced in the Northern Theater. The practical turning point of the battle thus consisted not of a single dramatic blow, but of reciprocal decisions to transition from offensive action to withdrawal and consolidation. For the Japanese command, the choice implied that preserving the squadron and preventing further damage now outweighed the possibility of destroying an already weakened enemy heavy cruiser. For the American side, accepting disengagement meant that the primary objective of disrupting the convoy and preventing an unchallenged supply run had been achieved to the extent possible with the available forces, even though no transports had been sunk. These decisions realigned the momentum of the campaign around the Komandorski Islands. Japanese planners would now have to reconsider how and whether to send future surface convoys into the Aleutians under similar conditions. American planners, analyzing the engagement, would adjust doctrines and readiness levels for future patrols in expectation that major surface actions in this area were still possible but might unfold under comparable constraints of fuel, ammunition, and limited air support. As the range continued to open and fire ceased, both commands issued formal orders to disengage. The American group, with Salt Lake City again under power but still bearing visible damage, turned toward the eastern Aleutians. Richmond and the destroyers closed in to form a tighter protective screen. Smoke screens, no longer needed to obscure enemy gunnery, were reduced to conserve fuel and free personnel for repair work. Speed was kept at a level that balanced the need to clear the battle area quickly with the realities of hull damage, compromised machinery on some ships, and uncertain fuel reserves. On board Salt Lake City, damage control parties stabilized flooding and reinforced shoring. Temporary repairs sealed some of the hull breaches, and engineers monitored boilers closely to ensure that remaining contamination did not cause a new loss of power. The ship's medical staff compiled casualty tallies, several dead and dozens wounded across the group, with Bailey and Salt Lake City accounting for most of the losses. The exact figures were transmitted in coded messages to higher command once radio silence restrictions were relaxed. Bailey and Coughlin, both damaged, proceeded at reduced speed under close escort to ensure that sudden failures would not leave them adrift in a remote and hostile sea. The Japanese squadron likewise shifted into withdrawal mode. Nachi and Maya turned onto headings that would take them back toward northern bases, with destroyers and light cruisers reforming a defensive arc oriented against possible submarine or air threats. Damage reports confirmed that Nachi had suffered multiple hits, causing several dozen casualties and impairing communications and fire control, while the other ships had escaped major structural damage. Ammunition inventories reflected heavy expenditure of main battery shells and torpedoes. Fuel calculations indicated that high-speed steaming during the pursuit had reduced safety margins for the return voyage, reinforcing the priority of withdrawal over renewed action. For all ships involved, the immediate post-battle hours were dominated by routine work under exceptional conditions. Crews removed unexploded fragments and secured loose equipment to prevent secondary damage in heavy seas. Fire control and radar personnel inspected instruments for shock damage and recalibrated where possible. Engineering teams on both sides adjusted watch rotations to account for fatigue from extended battle stations. Medical personnel continued treatment of burns, shrapnel wounds, and blast injuries, and in some cases performed surgery in makeshift operating spaces while ships rolled and pitched. As the American group approached its rear bases in the Aleutians, preparations began for more thorough assessment and repair. Dockyard officers were notified that Salt Lake City would arrive with significant hull and machinery damage, and that Bailey would require structural work and equipment replacement. Preliminary reports emphasized that no ships had been lost, despite having faced a force with superior surface firepower. These messages shaped early interpretations of the engagement within the North Pacific Command and provided a basis for decisions about awards, commendations, and future assignments. In Japanese ports, arrival procedures followed a similar pattern. Nachi entered harbor under her own power, but, with visible signs of damage to the superstructure and topside fittings, casualty lists were compiled and communicated to families through established channels. Fleet staff collected gunnery and damage data for analysis by technical and doctrinal sections, with particular attention to the performance of armor, the effects of American shells on control spaces, and the effectiveness of torpedo launches that had failed to achieve hits. The outcome, in which no enemy ships had been sunk and the convoy had not reached Attu, required explanation within the Fifth Fleet and to higher authorities. For the garrisons on Attu and Kiska, the most direct consequence in the short term was logistical. Supplies expected from the March convoy did not arrive as planned. Stocks of fuel, ammunition, and certain types of food and medical supplies remained under pressure. Commanders on the islands had to adjust consumption schedules and reconsider construction and training programs that depended on new materials. Weather and the continuing threat of interception limited alternative delivery methods. Submarines and aircraft could bring some cargo, but not in volumes comparable to a major surface convoy. Families and communities far from the battle area experienced the aftermath in a different temporal rhythm. On both sides, news of the engagement emerged gradually through official communiques, newspaper reports, and later, personal letters. In the United States, the action was described as a surface battle in the North Pacific in which American forces had prevented a Japanese supply convoy from reaching its destination. In Japan, the engagement was presented within the wider narrative of northern defense and the challenges of operating in extreme conditions. For relatives of those killed or wounded, official language about duty and service framed individual losses within broader national efforts. Within naval institutions, the aftermath phase also included formal analytical processes. Boards of inquiry and after-action review groups examined battle reports, gunnery plots, radar logs, and damage diagrams. On American ships, officers reviewed the performance of radar-directed fire, the handling of fuel contamination, and the conduct of destroyer torpedo attacks under heavy fire. In Japanese staff meetings, officers analyzed decision points, including the choice to withdraw, and assessed how efficiently the squadron had protected the convoy while managing ammunition and fuel. These evaluations would inform instructions for future operations, including recommendations on formation tactics, damage control drills, and criteria for breaking off surface engagements in remote theaters. By the time both squadrons had returned to their respective bases and immediate repairs were underway, the Battle of the Komandorski Islands had effectively transitioned from a live operation to a case study. Its short-term consequences, damaged ships, casualties, and an interrupted supply run were now fixed. How commanders and planners interpreted those outcomes would shape the next phase of the Aleutian campaign and influence the doctrinal and strategic lessons drawn from one of the war's few long-range daylight surface duels without air intervention. In later assessments of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Komandorski Islands came to be seen as a rare example of a protracted surface engagement, fought in daylight at long range without direct carrier or land-based air intervention. For the United States Navy, it demonstrated that a smaller force consisting of 1 heavy cruiser, 1 light cruiser, and 4 destroyers could engage a stronger opponent and prevent a major convoy from reaching its destination, provided that radar, maneuver, and determined damage control were effectively applied. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it highlighted the limits of surface operations in remote theaters, when logistics, fuel, and ammunition reserves were constrained, and when the risk of later air attack had to be weighed against continued pursuit. Strategically, the immediate effect was to complicate Japan's ability to maintain and reinforce the Aleutian garrisons. The March convoy that had been intended to deliver substantial supplies and personnel to Attu was forced to turn back, and subsequent attempts to use large surface groups in this role were reconsidered. The burden shifted increasingly towards submarines and smaller, more discreet shipments, which could not fully compensate for the interrupted flow of cargo. When American forces landed on Attu in May 1943 with an assault force of roughly 11,000 troops, they faced a Japanese garrison of about 2,300 to 2,600. Supported by stocks that had not been replenished as originally planned, the fighting that followed resulted in heavy losses on both sides, and the eventual elimination of the Attu garrison as a fighting force. For the United States, Komandorski contributed to the perception that the Aleutian campaign, though secondary compared to operations in the Central and South Pacific, required steady pressure and careful use of available resources rather than large-scale fleet engagements. The action informed later decisions on how to allocate cruisers and destroyers to northern waters and how to integrate land-based air into future operations. Lessons drawn from Salt Lake City's fuel contamination and recovery influenced engineering and damage control practices. Analyses of destroyer torpedo attacks under concentrated fire helped refine tactics for similar actions in other theaters. In Japanese naval doctrine, the battle entered discussions about criteria for continuing or breaking off surface engagements. Hosogaya's decision to withdraw, while still in possession of a numerically and, on paper, materially superior force, became a subject of internal debate. Subsequent commentary examined the balance he had attempted to strike between the protection of major fleet units, the convoy's mission, and the risk of attrition in a theater far from core bases. The engagement reinforced a broader tendency toward caution in the use of heavy cruisers, especially when ammunition and fuel had been heavily expended, and when air superiority could not be assured. Historically, casualty figures at Komandorski were modest compared to many other Pacific battles, but had significance for the communities and services involved. American losses amounted to several dozen killed and wounded, primarily on Salt Lake City and Bailey. Japanese casualties, concentrated on Nachi, were of a similar order. The engagement did not produce wrecks on the scale of carrier battles or major amphibious operations, yet it represented for the participants an extended test of endurance under cold, remote, and austere conditions. For many sailors, it was their principal experience of surface combat in the northern Pacific. The battle's legacy within the Aleutian campaign linked directly to the eventual recapture of the occupied islands. The failure of the March convoy to reach Attu contributed to the garrison's relative isolation before the May landings. Subsequent operations against Kiska in August 1943, carried out by a joint American and Canadian force, found that the Japanese had evacuated the island under cover of fog. In both cases, continued pressure on supply lines and the difficulty of sustaining remote positions with surface convoys helped shape Japanese decisions to fight on one island and to withdraw from another. In broader historical narratives, the Battle of the Komandorski Islands received less public attention than actions like Midway, Guadalcanal, or Leyte Gulf, yet it became a case study in naval staff colleges and analytical works. Its characteristics as a duel between cruisers and destroyers without air power, fought near the limits of supporting infrastructure, made it useful for examining command decision-making, risk assessment, and the interaction of material constraints with tactical choices. Analysts focused on how both sides interpreted incomplete intelligence, managed fuel and ammunition, and chose the point at which to shift from attack to disengagement. For the Soviet Union and other observers, the battle was one episode in a wider pattern of operations along the North Pacific Arc that influenced perceptions of security around the Kamchatka Peninsula and the Kuril chain. Although Soviet forces did not participate directly, the contest over the Aleutians and the nearby sea lanes affected assessments of how the northern approaches to Asia might be contested in future conflicts. Weather reporting, air routes, and naval basing in the region remain subjects of planning that drew on wartime experience, including engagements such as Komandorski. In the decades after the war, veteran accounts, official histories, and archival research added detail to the contemporary reports. Command decisions that had been made under pressure, with limited information and strict time constraints, were re-examined in light of later knowledge about opposing forces and intentions. For participants on both sides, memories of the battle often centered on specific moments: the near loss of Salt Lake City, when power failed, the hits on Nachi's bridge, the destroyer torpedo runs through shell splashes, and the eventual sight of opposing ships receding into the mist. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands thus occupies a distinct place in the history of the Pacific War. It did not alter the overall strategic balance by itself, but it influenced the conduct and outcome of the Aleutian campaign, shaped doctrines for surface warfare in constrained and remote theaters, and illustrated how logistical and environmental factors could govern the use of major fleet units. Its legacy lies in the detailed records and analyses that continue to inform understanding of how navies operate at the edge of their logistical reach, and how commanders reconcile immediate tactical opportunities with long-term preservation of their forces.